NFL draft. And the first guy I want to talk about, obviously, when we're talking big name guys, is Kwity Paye. Mm-hmm. Now, I look at, and again, I'm going to date myself on this one. Anybody under 25 will probably say who. But when I saw the numbers, the first two guys that came to mind for me were Dwight Freeney, a 6'1", 260-pound defensive end from Syracuse, and probably, if he's not already in the Hall of Fame, probably should be with the Colts. And actually, the first guy that came to mind who slid down a little bit because he didn't have quite the 40 was Elvis Dumervil, who played at Louisville and was a fourth-round pick. Now, Kwity Paye is higher than that, had a good time at Pro Day. Is he a little bit of a tweener? Does he come in? Could he fit in that outside linebacker 3-4? Because he didn't run his shuttle or his L cone, and I haven't seen him play as much as you have. That's why you're here. Give us a quick scouting report on Kwity.
Yeah, he absolutely could do that. I mean, first of all, let's rewind the tape a little bit back to Kwity coming out of high school, right?
Okay.
So Kwity was an Under Armour All-American, but he was not selected by the selection committee. He was voted in by the fans. He was voted in by Michigan. You know how huge.
Well, Michigan. I try to tell Michigan, Ohio State, and then there's a drop off to the third biggest fan base. It's just the way it is, folks.
Right. So he was there because he was a Michigan recruit, but you could tell when he got there that athletically he sort of fit in, but he was a little green. He was still sort of a baby in the game, not a baby body, but a baby in the game, and certainly a baby as a defensive end. You know, Kwity was at that point a 6'2", maybe 215, 220-pound defensive end. A guy who, as a high schooler, ran an 11-second flat 100-meter. So you knew he had athleticism, but this was a projection. This is one of those guys that if Don Brown, the defensive coordinator at the time, looking for those diamonds in the rough up there in the Northeast, this was one of them. And so we were thinking that it was going to take him some time to really get to the point physically where he could get on the field and contribute. Didn't take long at all. He was ready to go as a true freshman over some of the All-Americans that he came in onto campus with. So that told you that he had good football IQ, was able to put on some weight relatively quickly. So in that time, we saw him line up at defensive end. We saw him kick inside and pass rushing downs, bring him on some stunts, get him at that 3-tech and have him wreak some havoc with his quickness. I say that to say that he's a guy that physically can play on the line of scrimmage, but is fast enough and changes directions well enough to be able to stand up in certain situations, drop in some coverage, do some zone blitz stuff. So he is a tweener in the classic sense, but just because he's done so much, but I think physically he's more than that. I mean, as much as we look at a guy like Dumervil, as much as we look at a guy like Dwight Freeney, Kwity brings more size to the equation that will allow you to do some things up and down the line of scrimmage with him. The bigger question mark, Scott, is production. He didn't have the numbers that would say top 10, top 15 pick. So this is a general manager looking at him and saying, well, why? Why didn't he have that production?
Okay,
the things that I just talked about, Scott, they're moving him up and down. Some of the things they had him do, he's occupying blockers so the blitzes can get home. Those things contributed to maybe the numbers being depressed a bit.
Well, when you're describing him coming out of high school, the type of player that sprung to mind was TCU. Remember how the article about them, I believe in Sports Illustrated, they talk about recruiting. All they do is recruit running backs. Mm-hmm. Recruit guys that were running backs and then turn athletes and let them grow into it. I'll tell you, when I was watching him pass rush, another guy of that ilk that jumped right into mind was David Pollock. And people don't realize how good and athletic David Pollock was. He was a 3-time All-American for a reason and drafted in the first round as an outside linebacker after being a freshman All-American as a defensive tackle. That's a freak of an athlete. But I saw Kwity using his hands so well, and Pollock was as good as anybody I'd ever seen do that. Now, as part of that production, you mentioned how they moved him around a little bit. So let's ignore the production for a second. And how was his arc? How did he improve from beginning to end? What was his talent like from, maybe not necessarily from a production, but how did you see him progress through the years?
So this is where a general manager is going to make his money, right? Because you got to look at all the factors. He progressed really well. I mean, just from high school to freshman, he progressed more than a lot of guys you'll see coming in. Remember, I said he's a guy new to the game, really didn't really see himself as a college level, certainly a Michigan level football player until deep into his senior campaign. So his development from high school to college was huge. And then so he's on the field right away. Over the next couple of years, he becomes a player that is a fixture, a go-to guy, a guy or a dude. I can't remember what Don Brown, how he used to call him, but he was one of his main guys. But production. So two factors, moving him around. And then the other factor is, as you got deeper in Don Brown's tenure, the talent around him defensively, around Kwity defensively, wasn't what it was when, say, Rashawn Gary was there and Chase Winovich was, a prime guy. And so in his junior campaign, where he put up his numbers, there were some games in there where you looked at it and you said, okay, he didn't put up big numbers against Wisconsin. He didn't put up big numbers against Ohio State. He didn't put up big numbers against Alabama. And you will look at that and say, okay, well, in the bigger games, he didn't have the big production. We saw him in the offseason put in a lot of work. His body was even more finely tuned. He was quicker. He was faster. He seemed like he was ready to really bust out in his final year, but then COVID hit and he got injured. And so he wasn't on the field enough to really quantify that improvement. So you're going to have a scout is going to have to look at it. The general manager is going to have to look at it and say, all right, we see how he's improved in years past. We see some of the games in this junior campaign where maybe he fell short, mainly in the run game. Do we feel like he grew enough physically and worked on his game enough, his craft enough, that if he had played, he would have put up big time numbers and can do so in the NFL? I think the answer to that question is yes, just knowing him. Question will be how many general managers feel the same way.
Well, and that will be interesting because it's not a great year for defensive linemen in this draft. It is a very good draft, but it is not a great year for defensive linemen. And Kwity's got a chance to be the first defensive lineman taken, maybe even the first defensive player taken, depending on how well someone evaluates that. Now, after what Micah Parsons did at Penn State last week, he'd be my first player off the board. But it's there's a long way to go. So let's move on a little bit.